Welcome to the final video in the gradient series. In this video, we'll modify our gradient colors and work with various opacity settings to get creative blends for your gradients. If you'd like to follow along with this lesson, you can download the illustration from the link below this video. Let's take a look at some of the gradients that we have on our student workspace. When you select a gradient, you'll notice in the Tools panel the fill color picks up the gradient. If you have the gradient panel open, the gradient is selected here as well. So for the sky, we've got this really pretty linear gradient with 3 color stops. For the grass, it also has 3 color stops and is a linear gradient. Let's talk about opacity and what that means, and let's also discuss applying multiple gradients and how to edit each one of the gradients independently and look at the opacity. You'll notice a series of stars here across the top. If we select this first star and then look in the Appearances panel, this particular star has a gradient fill and the opacity is 63%. It has another fill that is also a gradient made up of black and white, and the opacity on that one is 48%. Opacity is a method of making elements transparent. So looking in the Appearances panel, this opacity setting is related to this fill color, which is an orange gradient. This opacity setting is related to this fill color, which is the black and white gradient. And you'll also notice that we have another opacity setting, and that guy is for the entire selected object. Let's see how this works. We'll click here in the gray area to make sure neither one of the fills are selected. And with our star selected, let's first check out the orange gradient right here on the top. The orange gradient is set to an opacity of 63%. If we'd like to change that, we'll click here and we can change the opacity. If we pull it to the left, notice the star at the top, you'll see less and less of the orange. If we drag this opacity slider all the way to the left, it'll be completely transparent for the orange fill and you won't see any of it at all. The more we pull this guy over to the right, the darker it becomes, or the more opaque. If we pull it all the way over to the right, you probably won't even see the black underneath, but only see the orange gradient fill. As we slide this around, you'll see different variations for the orange gradient fill. Okay? If we needed to work on the black one, we'll select the black gradient fill, and the opacity slider will let us adjust the amount of black that we see underneath. If I pull this guy over to the left, we won't see hardly any at all, and over to the right, we'll see more and more of the black. Another thing to keep in mind, you can reorder any of your fills and strokes. I could take this black fill, pull it up in the list, and then we'd see more black than orange. So with every fill, you can adjust the opacity setting, and also this guy on the bottom lets you change the opacity for the entire selected object. So we'll click here to deselect both of the fills, and with our star selected, if we wanted to change the opacity of the entire star, we could either click here on this little blue link. There's also a transparency panel that we can use to adjust the opacity of the entire object. As we move the slider to the left, the object becomes more transparent. So let's look at the other stars that we have over in the blue box. If we select this star, the default opacity for the entire object is 100%. If we take this guy and move it down over the mountains, you won't be able to see through it. This guy here, the opacity for this object is 50%. So if we move this down, you'll be able to see through it. This guy here, the opacity is 25%. So if we move it, you can see even more of the black mountain behind that guy. Now that we understand that not only can we have multiple gradients on a selected object, but you can also change the opacity per gradient and for the entire object, let's get a little more creative. Let's see what we can do with this grass on the bottom. So this guy is selected, and we see that it has a fill color, which is this gradient, an opacity of default, which means 100%, and we also see that the entire object has an opacity of default, which means it's 100%. This gradient is made up of 3 different color greens, and to get a different effect, we can not only move the sliders to see more or less of the different colors of green. You can do that, and in addition to that, you'll notice that each color stop has an opacity setting. So we can get more or less of each color by pulling the opacity slider to the left for less color and to the right for more. Let's select this orange sky, and we see that it has a nice pretty gradient. The colors are here. Default opacity for the fill and for the entire object. Let's see what happens if we add another fill with another gradient. If you look in the swatches panel, you'll see some pretty cool gradients that are here by default. Some of these are great. Let's go to the appearance panel, and we want a new gradient, so we'll click right here at the menu and choose new fill and select the swatch that we'd like to add. Let's get this one right here. It's a radial gradient. It says Super Soft Black Vignette. This one has a little bit of transparency. Anytime that you see a checkerboard, that means that it has transparency, which is no color at all. Alright, so now that we've added a different fill, we'll look over in the gradient panel and see not only can we adjust opacity sliders, but we can adjust colors if we wanted to as well. Let's see how that'll look. We know that we can pull the color stops to get different variations, and we also know that if we double click the color stops, we can choose different colors. Additionally, we can change the opacity per color stop. So you can get very creative with gradients, changing the colors, and the opacity. Maybe choose a blue color here and bump down the opacity setting to see if we can get a nice soft blue background. When creating gradients, it's always fun to take a minute to experiment with different colors, different opacity settings, and different levels of each gradient until you get the effect that you're looking for. In this last video of the gradient series, we learn more about gradients and change the opacity settings of our objects, gradient fills, and color stops. In the next series, we'll learn how to use type in Illustrator. See you then.